Epilogue. The Guardian Series Part 9, by Stephen Lake. Paul perked up as the sensation of someone approaching their area poked at his mind. But this new someone wasn't arriving by air. Rather, they were teleporting to his location. A few moments later a fellow Guardian appeared in a flash not far away. But what he held in his arms surprised Paul. It was Tyrone. He watched as the Guardian gently set the enigmatic Rex on the ground, and then floated back several feet as though watching over him, uncertain of what he should expect from him, or his request to be brought to this place. "What are you doing here?" Paul asked in surprise. Looking around the area at the incredible carnage and destruction that the battle against the Emperor had caused, Tyrone was aghast at what he saw. He then winced in pain as the great clouds of blowing ash around him quickly invaded his throat and sinuses. Realizing this, Paul quickly healed him, and then placed a special energy filter mask, similar to his own, over Tyrone's face. Now the friendly Rex could breathe properly, and was clearly grateful for this small gift. He then turned and saw that most of his fellow Rexes had survived the battle, and were presently being kept in ward until someone could decide what to do with them. While the loss of even one of them saddened Tyrone, he still felt glad that the majority of them had survived. "I see that the Emperor's army has been soundly defeated," he said. Paul pursed his lips slightly. "Yeah, he has. The weirdest part is, when he died, so did most of the monsters." "Only your fellow Rexes didn't," he replied. Tyrone grinned at this. "That is because, unlike us, they were made entirely of energy from the Emperor himself," he said. Paul looked at him curiously. "So they were just illusions?" he asked. Tyrone grinned at this. "Not illusions, so much as beings who had no substance of their own outside of what was given to them by the Emperor," he said. "Then how did you get mixed up in all of this if all he had to do was make his own army on the fly like he did?" asked Paul. "Unlike those who came before, or after us, we became willing slaves of the Emperor several dimensions ago, in an effort to save our lives. We're the only ones who ever did. The other races, when given the choice of either becoming his slaves, or die, chose death, rather than live in an eternity of servitude. It is true that we did not actually want to be his slaves. However, one must do what they have to in order to survive." Paul glared at Tyrone in disappointment. "Even killing innocent people?" he asked. Tyrone shrugged. "I didn't say that what we did was right, only that we did what we had to in order to survive. If we had not, he would have killed us long ago without so much as a moment's hesitation. But, let us not allow such things to come between us. Through your courageous actions, you have freed us, and saved your world at the same time. One such as you should feel proud of having achieved a momentous, and seemingly impossible thing." Paul frowned at this. "Oh, I know we are. However, that now begs the question of what we should do with this," he said, pointing at the massive black orb next to him. Tyrone looked at the orb briefly, and then shook his head. "Whatever you do, I would strongly advise against touching that, unless you wish to become his next unwilling host," he said. "The Emperor?" asked Paul. Tyrone nodded. "It's how his last host became enslaved as he did," he said. "So the Emperor is just this big black thing?" Tyrone nodded. "He is, and yet he is not. The Emperor is much, much more than merely this great black core you see before you. However, I shall spare you the details, as I am uncertain that it is necessary for you to know the full depth of such things at this time, only that you should not touch it." Paul nodded slightly. "Yeah, we already figured it wouldn't be a good idea to do that, so we left it alone." Tyrone nodded. "And it is good that you have. However, what do you intend to do with it now?" he asked. Paul gently scratched his chin as he studied the orb briefly. "That, I'm not really sure of. I was kinda thinking of just blowing it up," he replied. But to his surprise, Tyrone shook his head. "You should not. Doing so will allow him to re-establish himself again, and take over new, possibly multiple hosts, which you will not be able to detect until it is too late. This has happened before on other worlds, and they have all suffered greatly because of such foolish actions," he said. Paul pondered this briefly as he again studied the orb. Then what do we do with this thing? He asked. Do you have the ability to lift it without touching it? Asked Tyrone. Paul gestured lightly to the orb, causing it to lift briefly, and then settle back down to the ground. Yeah, that's pretty easy. It's one of the skills that came with our superpowers when they showed up a couple years back. Why? He asked. Since the Emperor cannot be destroyed, leaving him here, in this world full of energy where he can eventually regain his former strength, is foolish. As such, I believe it best if we return him to the former world from which he came. Paul pondered this briefly. Why there? He asked. Because, before coming here as he did, he would have completely consumed the last of the usable energy that remained in that world. Thus, were he returned there, he would be unable to restore himself to his previous state as there would be insufficient resources for him to do so. Paul pondered this briefly. So then it had become like a prison to him? He asked. Tyrone nodded. It would indeed. But, are you sure there's no more usable energy over there? I mean, the last time I visited the other side there was plenty of heat, air, sunlight, and so on. Admittedly, the ambient energy that gives me my powers was fully depleted, but there was still lots of other energy in that world. Tyrone nodded at this. Yes, natural energy, such as the sun, the moon, and the stars still exist in that dimension. But the energy that gives him his strength is not the same as the natural energy which lights and heats your world. They are similar in name, but of different natures. Paul thought about this for a few moments, and then nodded. All right, that seems reasonable. So we just need to eat him through the nearest portal, back to where he came from, and then slam the door behind him, right? Tyrone nodded. That would be best. Paul then looked over at the 3 stone portals, the same ones that the Emperor had sent his armies through only a short time earlier, and studied their inert, silent forms. How exactly do we open one of those things? I've never done that before, he said. Tyrone grinned at this. They simply need power to operate. They already know how to do the rest on their own, he replied. Paul looked at Tyrone in confusion. So, just pump some energy into them, and then, abracadabra, the magic happens, he asked. Tyrone chuckled. Something like that, he replied. Deciding to give it a try, just as Tyrone had suggested, he gestured to the giant orb that was the remains of the Emperor, walked over to the 3 stone portals, with the orb floating in tow, and then touched one of the rings in front of him. To his shock and surprise, the great stone portal suddenly absorbed a massive amount of energy from him, and did it so rapidly that it felt like someone had sucked the very air out of his lungs. He quickly let go of it, and then felt his power rebound almost immediately. Paul then checked himself over to make sure he was okay, and found that nothing had been damaged. The only difference he felt now was a slight dip in his overall power levels. Moments later the portal activated, once more bridging the expanse between the 2 dimensions. Paul then gestured to the orb, and sent it sailing through the portal. However, due to its incredible size, it almost didn't fit. Thankfully, though, it successfully made it through and landed on the other side. A few moments later the portal flickered, and then closed as it ran out of power. Satisfied with having safely completed that, Paul slapped his hands together, as though brushing off dust that had collected on them, and smiled. Welp, that's done. May he rot forever in a cold, dead world of his own making, he said. Tyrone grinned. Indeed, may it be so. Paul then briefly looked at the 3 stone circles that stood before him, and pondered what to do with them, before turning to Tyrone. So what do we do with these? I can't think that we'd want to just leave them laying around given what they're capable of, and where they terminate at. Tyrone thought about this briefly, and then said, should the Emperor ever regain his powers, even if such is unlikely to ever occur, he will know how to re-enter this dimension again should he wish to. However, after having been soundly defeated by you, I do not believe that he will ever do such a thing, lest he be defeated a second time. Therefore, should we choose to destroy these portals, it will not be done in necessity to protect this world, but rather to keep the foolish from seeking out his lands, and their own demise. Paul pondered this for several moments, and soon nodded. Then, with a simple flick of his wrist, all 3 portals exploded outward, like a puff of dust, and disintegrated into 1,000 pieces, forever rendering them inert and incapable of being used again. Tyrone watched this in amazement. "Your control of your powers is amazing," he replied. Paul shrugged at this. Once you fight enough Rexes, you get good at them," he chided. Tyrone grinned at this. "Indeed," he replied. "So, now that the war is over, what's going to become of you?" asked Paul. Tyrone rubbed his chin in thought, and then replied, "While we were talking with your leaders, during the time they were debriefing us, we asked them the same question." "And?" asked Paul. "We came to an agreement that, if we helped them, they would give us a place where we could live out the rest of our lives in peace. But only if the Emperor was defeated, and we did not either betray or fail them." Paul pondered this briefly. "That's nice of them to do that. But are you sure they won't renege on their agreement? I mean, given that you're not originally from here, not to mention all of the things you've done to our world, they really don't have any reason to protect you." Tyrone thought about this briefly, and then frowned ever so slightly. "Unfortunately, I do not believe it will be honored, considering all that we have done. Even so, given that we have willingly risked our lives to help save your world, I feel that such actions should earn us, at the very least, some small degree of compassion from you." Paul thought about this briefly, and then nodded. "I agree. But that decision is out of my hands." Tyrone nodded. "I understand. Therefore I will pray that, should such be required, you will come to my defense, and that of my people." Paul smiled. "If it comes to that, I'll see what I can do." Tyrone grinned. "And I will be very grateful for your kindness should that day come." The 2 of them then made their way down to where the other Rexes were gathered, and quietly spoke to them, helping each and every one of them to understand that they were now not only free, but safe as well, as the Guardian Corps, who was once their sworn and mortal enemy, would now be their protectors. Over the next several weeks, as the world slowly adjusted to their new post-war existence, much discussion was made over the fate of the Rexes between the governments of the world. Through all of this, with Tyrone's wise words, and Paul's assistance, an agreement of mutual understanding and peace was formed between the 2 sides. As a result of this, the Rexes were granted blanket immunity, and given the uninhabited tropical island of Santa Lucia, just off the coast of Africa, as their new home. And the Rexes wasted no time transforming it into a paradise that they could happily enjoy for the rest of their lives. Even so, despite their mandated isolation from the rest of the world, a number of Guardians, including Paul himself, periodically visited the island to check in on them, and see how they were doing. And the Rexes appreciated that. They then lived on in peace, and isolation, for many decades to come, with their only problems being the occasional illegal poachers who sought to kill them for sport, and take their skins as trophies. Other than that, life was generally quiet, and tranquil for them. The same was true for the Guardians. Now that the Emperor was gone, and the world was no longer in danger, they found themselves relegated to simple hero work, most of which involved saving the world from both unexpected dangers, as well as its own generous stupidity. And, much to Paul's relief, despite Destin's grim prediction of darker days coming once the threat from the Emperor was gone, the governments of the world wisely chose not to repatriate them, and instead agreed to leave them in their original, independent form, which would allow them to better serve and protect humanity. This would be especially important if another threat like the Emperor ever arose. Their decision also had the welcome benefit of bringing a lasting peace, for the most part, to the entire world. However, this peace would not last, as a new enemy, who hailed from a distant corner of the galaxy, would soon appear and stretch out its dark, shadowy fingers over the planet Earth. And it was an enemy that was so evil that even the most perverse villainy of the Emperor could not compare. The end.